Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Rewind and Replay. I'm Matan.
I'm Adriana.
And I'm Caitlin.
And today we are talking about queerness in the apocalypse. We kind of, in our games, we got a little broad with apocalypse, we got a little broad with queerness, but the point is we wanted to have discussions about why and how queer characters are so prevalent in sort of end of the world games and situations.
In the spooky season times.
In spooky season times. Nothing scarier.
Queer people.
Queer people.
Nothing scarier
It's
than being gay.
The gay agenda. They're going to
Than
get you.
being
Everybody watch
happy?
out.
Wow.
Yeah. Absolutely not.
Absolutely.
The scariest thing, happiness. It just clicked. It just clicked. People don't want to be happy. There you go.
True.
Wow. Okay, Nietzsche.
We figured it out. We don't even need a podcast anymore.
Crack the code. The end.
And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, everybody.
Less than a minute. That was so easy.
So, everybody put your bet scorecards down. We are going to be talking about Last of Us within the first 2 minutes.
Absolutely. It's the first thing we're talking about.
That's the first one up. We're going to be talking about we talk about Ellie a lot. Specifically, right now, we're going to be discussing mostly Lev, a character in Last of Us Part 2, and his portrayal in the game as a trans character.
Needless to say, massive spoilers for kind of everything.
That's true. Let me write. I should take that note down. I don't want to forget and then have this game spoiled for someone.
But if you haven't played it by now, what are you doing?
True.
Yeah, I mean
I think it's nice to throw the spoilers out there, but like if you get spoiled at this point, it's kind of on you. It's been long enough. All right, so Lev's portrayal in Last of Us 2 was controversial. And
I mean, a lot about the game was controversial.
That's true. And but at this time, I'm not just talking about like, Gamergate incels didn't like it. I mean, like within the trans community, within the queer gaming community, it was controversial.
Yeah.
What did you guys think about the way that Lev's identity was handled in the game?
I personally
there was like a lot of discourse around The Last of Us when it came out for like any topic you can imagine. So I was definitely, like on Twitter and reading articles and everything then. And so I got to see some of the opinions on Lev, and I thought that was very helpful. One of the things that was really abrasive when playing the game was Abby's fucking insistence on like asking Lev 800 questions.
I read in this article from Paste Magazine, apparently like there are 3 separate instances in which Abby asks him about him cutting his hair specifically, which is kind of the crux of, which is sort of the inciting incident of Lev's story. But like if the kid doesn't want to talk about it, the kid doesn't want to talk about it. Like, you can like ask once and then stop, Yeah,
and I think that's part of the issue was that it was very much trying to lead you to be like, oh, there's something different about him. There's something there. And I think that gets into one of these articles that we talk about here, where Lev is more written not for transgender people, but for cisgender people who are supporting transgender people. And I think personally that's why when I first played through the game, I was like, oh, I love Lev. Yeah, he's great. And then I started, as Adriana said, or as she did also, I started like going online and looking more, and I was like, oh yeah, like that makes sense.
I also think,
it's problematic in ways. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to talk for your experience with the game, but when I was playing it, like I didn't feel like it was a big secret that this is like a trans kid, because it's not like he's on hormones. They don't have that technology. I thought it was pretty obvious. And I have a few trans like close friends, so Abby's like pushing was really annoying. But at the same time, like it gets weird when you're an adult and this is a child, and like you need to know things to protect them quite literally, especially in the apocalypse. So I think it's a thin line that they had to tread.
That's true. That's very true. I actually, building on that point, there's sort of a moment. Again, it'll be linked in the description. There's a great article from Paste Magazine.
Yeah, the author is at Hotel Bones, I think, on Twitter.
Thank you for throwing that tag out. The article is on the negative side, saying that the depiction of Lev is kind of shallow and harmful in some ways, really for cisgendered allies rather than trans people. But there's a moment in the game in which Lev's sister Yara and Abby are talking, and sort of that's when Yara tells Abby, I think it's Abby knows that Lev is trans now, but Yara tells Abby Lev's whole backstory about how Lev came out to her and she told him to, keep it to himself. And then they're like attacked by their mother, and then they ended up fleeing the Seraphites because their whole community wanted to kill Lev, and Yara had to support him. And that's a moment where Yara is telling Abby things that it should be Lev's to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, to me, one of the standout points. When I finished the game, I also was like, wow, like this is a fantastic win for trans representation. And I do think that only to a point. I think this is a very good point that like this was about Yara like dealing with her guilt and feeling better. It wasn't about Lev. Lev didn't have agency in this moment.
Mm-hmm. I should have looked this up beforehand and I forgot. Were there any, and like, I don't know if you guys know either, but were there any transgender people working on the game?
Yeah, there were.
Okay. That's good to know then.
So, but that article by Pace Magazine, I believe, was written by a trans woman, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting though, and I think this is kind of the controversy around The Last of Us in general, or for the second game. But and I think Caitlin, you'll resonate with this. When Waverly, the author, says Lev's story isn't made for trans people, but to give cisgender players a space to connect with their guilt and pity and kind of empathize. Right. Mm-hmm. I think that's what some of us are feeling with Ellie. This isn't made for people like Ellie. This is made for people not like Ellie, to empathize and experience, and which is important. Like, it's important. Like, this game is so fucking important. Lev's story is important, but we're not hearing it from Lev. We're not experiencing it as Lev,
and that's important. That's why I disagree on Ellie's perspective. On your point on Ellie, is I think that like Ellie being played, like, you go through the shit that Ellie goes through her mental struggles at the end of the game, through her development of her relationship with Dinah. I think Dina, I always say Dina. That's one distinction that I think is important. Not that trans characters can't be supporting characters, of course, but there's a great quote from the second article that I'll talk more about from Washington Post, that when there are more games about trans characters with trans characters from trans creators, games like The Last of Us won't feel like battlegrounds because there will be enough games about us, developed by us, to go around. So like this it is important that they nail trans representation because it is so rare.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually that is a fantastic article, by the way. Julie Muncy, amazing. And these two kind of side. Yeah, I mean they're both like two sides of one coin. I mean, I think they both probably really enjoyed the game, but just like thinking about this content in different ways is really interesting.
Yeah.
But anyways, I think that's interesting from that point of view. Like, when there are more, when there's more representation, when we see more trans people, it'll be less important is kind of like the vibe that's coming off as, right? Like, oh, we can tell a trans story from a cis perspective. And I mean, again, I don't think that's what Julie Muncy is saying, but that's the vibe.
Well, but Julie Muncy,
I think it's important always. Right, I know.
So I guess what I'm saying is like, sorry, go ahead.
That it's less important to nail representation every single time. I think it's important.
Well, it is important
all
to
the
nail
time, no matter how many stories we get.
But it gives you flexibility. Like, the problem with like, there's the character him in Powerpuff Girls, like a very clearly like gay coded character as like a villain and is like just totally flamboyant, like we can have characters like that if that isn't the only gay representation. When there is a lot of it, then of course people are going to know that's not the only way that gay people are. But when you have a variety of representation that shows, you know, queer people in a lot of different settings with different personalities, then you can have more, you can put queer characters in more situations because you aren't bearing the brunt of all of like so much of so much representation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes some sense, right? Like to a degree, like either way, like no matter, like if we have, you know, if we start seeing trans characters in so many games, I still would want Lev to be the one to tell his own story and not his sister.
Yeah.
Sure. You're right. And
or for us to like play through a flashback or, you know, whatever kind of mechanic.
Yes. I think that would have been better.
For.
You're right. I think that would have been better. Like, I think there was always development to be done. I think that like that incident is pretty, that article is a pretty searing indictment of Lev's depiction. Julie Munsey's article in the Washington Post is much more middle ground. I can read a quote that says, in which she says, "I liked Lev's story. The character resonated with me, and I'll be thinking about him and Abby for a while yet. But without real empowerment and representation for trans people in media, that's not good enough. If you want to actually show compassion to marginalized communities, few compassions resonate like letting us speak for ourselves and paying us to do it." Like, I think this character can resonate, and this character can be like a net positive while also needing work. Mm-hmm. I think it's important not to, you know, and I'm saying this as a cis man, but I think it's important not to be searing of every single piece of representation that's not perfect. I think you should be critical of it for sure. Yeah. But I think like we need to like point out like, here are some of the ways in which Lev succeeded. Here are the numerous ways in which Lev failed. These are the ways in which to improve.
So for the first article, right, that we're talking about from Pace, mm-hmm. I don't think they're criticizing Lev in any way. They probably also resonated quite a bit with Lev, right? So I think a lot about this discussion is how radical an approach we're going to take, right? Like something from the Washington Post by someone who was neither condemning nor praising, you know, it's more middle ground. It's more palatable.
But I also think that undermines, I agree, but I also think that kind of undermines Julie Munsey's agency. Like she says, his reactions to his circumstances make sense to me as a trans person. I know people who think and behave the way he does. I recognize a part of myself in him. This is what I want from my trans characters. I think Washington Post is a middle ground thing, but I also think that Julie Munsey's points are personal and valid.
I didn't say that they're not.
You're right. Hey. I'm just emphasizing that they are. I think we shouldn't overemphasize the fact that it's the Washington Post, because the Washington Post has put out some, pretty serious, intense, opinionated stuff.
Yeah, every news site is capable of.
For sure.
Caitlin, what do you think?
Yeah, I just agree. I didn't really disagree with anything you guys said. I liked both articles. I think, as Matan was saying, it's really good to understand why we initially may have been like, oh, this is great representation. And then because like we are cisgender and we may not have had those experiences and just thought, like, oh, this is great. We loved it. And then later on gone and stepped back and been like, okay, this may be why it's not as great as we originally thought. And this is how it can improve. And I think that's really great to like understand why we thought it was great to begin with, and like not necessarily have to go back and be like, oh, this is terrible, cancel this story, but go back and understand why it might not be as great as we initially thought, and go back through and understand how it can be done better and how representation can always be done better. And I think that's a really good point.
I'm also really glad when doing research for this, I was able to find an abundance of articles written by trans people. Those were the first ones that came up. And so I'm glad that the community is getting the agency to like speak on this shit directly.
Exactly.
Like, the game is already filtered through a cisgender lens. It's nice that the discourse around it is not consistently being filtered that way.
Speaking of, let's move to our next game. And
I wanted to give a shout out real quick. I really like the decision to have Abby be a muscular woman who is not lesbian or trans. I think that is also very important in terms of representation of those communities, to not be shoehorned in that way. But let's move on.
Fair enough. I have issues with Abby, so
Sure.
I'll accept the ton. Anyways, our next one is a Resident Evil, Crispin Jettingham. He is a gay character, and I already forgot which game it was.
Operation Raccoon City.
Was it? Oh, that was the one. Okay, yeah. I was thinking of the movie again. That was, yeah.
I mean, they're both in Raccoon City.
Yes,
But, yeah.
Okay, so with this game, they did not outright say within the game that he was gay, which is interesting. I think they did it for good reasons. So in this article that I was reading by Polygon, it talks about how the studio wasn't necessarily against having a gay character, but they were very afraid that it was going to hurt sales.
Mm-hmm.
So the writer of these characters, Adam Lloyd, he never explicitly says that Jettingham is gay. He does add little clues in there, and he's not like outright trying to like hide the fact that he's gay. He just also doesn't really think that it's like super important to say. So like one thing that he puts in the game is Jettingham is known by the handle of DA, which like it's spelled like DEE-AY, which is a play on like DA, which is short for Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was like implemented in the US government with the military in 1993. If you don't know what it is, it was like when the military wouldn't ask about people's sexuality because they didn't want like gay people in the military. So they didn't like, don't ask, don't tell that you're gay. So DA was his code name in this game. So that was kind of like a reference to that.
Which is super strong because he is a military man. Like if you're thinking in the context of military and you hear DA,
exactly,
what you gonna think?
You're probably not thinking of the district attorney's office.
No.
So yeah, and like that's part of exactly what Lloyd wanted to portray with this character. He wanted to create this military man that represented these gay men that were serving in the military at the time, that were just like normal people that just happened to be gay but also wanted to serve their country. And I think that's really important because like again, he wants to make sure not to fall into that stereotype, kind of like what you were talking about with Abby, where it's like we don't want to go into a stereotype where we're just like making these characters like caricatures of what everyone thinks they are. We want to like actually represent just normal people who just happen to be gay. And so that's what he did here. He wanted to create this like military man who just happened to be gay. And his reasoning for like never game is just because there's like never really a moment for him to come out and be like, hey, I'm gay. Like that's just not what people do. You don't like just say it randomly. I do have problems with this because I don't think that's like a really good excuse. I think you can show it without having to have the character have this like deep discussion with everyone.
Say it, yeah.
Because I mean there's plenty of characters in the world that are straight that are
it's not broadcast, it's not directly stated, but it's evident.
Yeah. And so that's like my main issue with that. But I do think it's really great what he was trying to do and what he did. And this game is like a few years old. Like the article was written in 2014. And I think the game also came out then or a little bit before. I'm not positive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good attempt. And I like the message. And I think we're seeing this trend more with like people who also happen to be X. Especially in the disabled community, right? So like you would say a person with a disability, right? You wouldn't say a disabled person. And it is kind of the same thing for other identities that tend to be minorities, right? Like he is a man who is also a soldier, who is also gay, right? Like there are multiple things that make up and define him. It is not just gay man. So I just think maybe it was like a little too ahead of its time for that. Like in 2014, we maybe could have used like him wearing a little pride flag or some shit, you know?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to like Ellie in the first Last of Us. Like she's gay very in the first game. It's never said or stated until we get the DLC. And I mean, Bullied actually, like, he calls out Joel as a character. He says, explain to me how Joel and Booker DeWitt, both angry, violent white men rescuing attractive, big-eyed young girls, are not pretty much the same character. The industry seems to now exist in a permanent creative coma when it comes to character diversity. I find it really depressing.
That actually, well, I've got two things to say. One, that actually reminds me very much of a video essay that I watched, I think by Lessons. Oh no, I don't actually remember who it was by, but it was about what he called the daddening of video games. How like gruff father figures undertake like a surrogate daughter and a journey to like take care of her, and that's exactly what it seems like Bully is touching on.
And so by having a gruff potential father figure, like man who fights, who is not associated with women in that way or in any way really, I think it's good in theory, maybe didn't work out so hot in practice.
Yeah, I think this character raises questions to me that this is kind of this is a much larger question politically and socially about do you compromise, work within the system and take small achievable steps, or do you stick to your guns and not bend in the hope of like push it, not compromise your beliefs and push those through? And both have worked at different times. And it seems like he went the former, and that he Capcom is a Japanese company, and I don't totally understand like queer communities in Japan, but I know it's a much more conservative in that way than it is here.
Have you seen anime?
Yeah, that's why. Fair point. But
they're holding hands and they're wearing matching rings, but they're not gay. They're not married. It's okay.
That's what. Yeah, it's interesting in that it seems like it's just talked about more here. But I actually am not very educated on the subject. I probably shouldn't be making statements on that. Putting this character in, Adam got a gay character into this game that he probably would not have been able to do if he had just, said, hey, I'm putting this gay character in. But at the same time, this character is heavily compromised in his portrayal. It's kind of a vice.
I think it's interesting because the article did say that Capcom was supportive. Like, they didn't ask him to change the character or anything, but it also said that Bullied wasn't sure how much they realized.
If they even understood.
Yeah, exactly. Because of how little was put in there. So I think, like you're saying, it was kind of a bit of both of he wanted to put it in there, but then he wanted to also make sure it didn't get cut.
Right. It's
if
hard
you push too hard.
Yeah.
Then you get nothing. Exactly. It's a gamble on how to approach these things, and I think we're still figuring out the best ways.
I mean, quite literally with love, right? We get an amazing, complex trans character whose backstory is told from his sister, right?
From his sister's perspective. Right.
We're trying.
Yeah.
Right.
We're trying, I guess.
And and that game does have a lesbian protagonist, but you only play as white people for all of the games. It's important to recognize progress, but it's also very important to consistently be critical of these things and recognize the ways in which they fall short.
And this is kind of making, I think a big way that this falls short is that they're all under the umbrella category. I almost said Umbrella Academy. Jesus,
I heard
umbrella
it.
category. Category of horror. These are horror apocalypse games. And I think, we can talk about that once we get through our list. But I'm trying, but maybe not good enough.
Exactly. That's kind of the problem. One of the last things I'll say on this game is also broader. The with the like a character who happens to be blank, you have to navigate that adeptly, because you don't want to make, you know, a black character who is written in basically just sounding like exactly like how a white character is, and then they just, you know, make his skin black. Like, you have to make, I believe in intersectionality, and I believe that, like, you know, a person's ethnicity, the culture in which a person is raised, is inextricable from their identity. Also, queerness is inextricable from one's identity. That doesn't mean that it has to, every story about a queer person has to be about their queerness, but that also means that, like, writing a straight person and then just at the end changing their love interest to a man, and, you know, a queer man changing their love interest to a man, like, that is not necessarily enough.
Yeah.
I mean, think about if
gay.
Sorry, say that again, Caitlin.
What did I say? Just afterward, like, writing what you said, like writing a character and then afterwards being like, oh yeah, they were gay the whole time. Like, that doesn't work. I'm not saying that's what Bully did here, because like he
off at J.K. Rowling.
Going with that. Yeah, I mean,
such a fucking terrified. I hate her.
I don't think that's what Bullied was doing here, because
you're right. Yeah, I agree.
No.
I agree.
No.
He wrote the character,
but imagine
out saying that he was gay. That was like planned out the entire time. But it's still like you were saying, like, being gay is still part of who he is. And even though, sure, he's not going to be going around saying like, hey, I'm gay all the time.
Right.
Still, you're still going to like learn it. Like, you know,
right.
You know someone for a long time and then never learn that they're gay. You know, there's
right.
things that you happen and they say. And like, I get what he was trying to do by like not wanting him to say it. And like, I think that's great, but I think there are other ways that it can be portrayed.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Show, don't tell. Yeah.
Yes. Don't ask.
And I really liked what Matan was saying, because imagine if Crispin Jettingham was a black gay man. Like, I do not think that would have gone well.
Especially not from a Japanese company.
Yeah, I mean, some companies, writers, developers have a hard time juggling more than one category that isn't straight white man. So.
Yeah, like you can make somebody's queerness, a character's queerness, integral to who they are without making it their entire personality. Yes. And that's kind of the space that more games are inhabiting, more media is inhabiting, but it needs to even more.
And we see this perfectly in Life is Strange with Max.
Yep. I love Max.
Yeah.
Yeah, Life is Strange.
That game,
I love Life is Strange.
Me too.
That game hits, man. It slaps.
We should do a whole episode on Life is Strange sometime. I have a lot of thoughts about that game, but specifically this time we're talking about the love story with Chloe and the end of Arcadia Bay.
And okay, so speaking of, y'all might be wondering, what does this have to do with the apocalypse? There aren't zombies in this game. There's no fire and brimstone. But like the whole time you're trying to stop some really bad shit from happening. That is pretty apocalyptic, maybe on a smaller scale, but apocalyptic nonetheless.
Yes.
It is the town will die.
It's not the end of the world, it's the end of her world.
Yeah.
Which is
which is Chloe and Arcadia Bay.
Okay.
Sorry?
Oh, I'm back. Okay, sorry, I froze and then I was trying to figure out what was going on.
I really, everybody knows by now that I'm a sucker for these like choice-based Telltale-esque games. I really love the development of the relationship with Chloe. I love the like friends as kids grew apart and then reunite as lovers. Love that trope. Really into it. I also like the ending being that like, it's common you like the greater good or the person you love. That's been done before. But like not only was Max making that choice, if she chose to save the world, the town, not only would Chloe die, Chloe would forget her. Chloe would die, having never ever been with Max, which is heartbreaking.
So who do you guys?
I mean,
which one
at the end, I was gonna say at the end, it was a. Caitlin, you're really quiet. What?
What? I don't. My Wi-Fi is like dying right now. I think. Let me switch Wi-Fi's.
Okay. But so at the end, the choice was really easy for me.
Really?
Like, which I know is no.
Yeah.
I didn't. I saved the town. And I think just because personally, my taste is not a woman like Chloe. And I know some of you agree with this, but I really shipped Max.
I'm kind of here for that though. Like, I love Chloe. I'm kind of here for that.
Honestly,
but like Victoria is my type.
She's such a bitch. I love her.
I love it. I kind of liked Chloe and Rachel better together, and like you don't really get that unless you played Before the Storm. But like,
I actually didn't.
They're so perfect together.
But what I love is like it's also a story of heartbreak. Like Chloe is dealing with the loss of this person she was so close to. Chloe's character is fantastic. I really love Max and Chloe together. I also do think Max and Victoria have so much tension. It is so tense that I bet they just hate fuck one another. I really, I think that like the development of Max and Chloe's relationship, the kind of the will they won't they for a while, the difference in personality, Chloe being very outspoken and very sort of anti-establishment and very like anarchist, and Max really much more playing by the rules and being kind of a do-gooder. It was just I think that was well written.
I think it's interesting because this game felt more freeing in terms of being queer, right? Like there were
How do you mean?
A ton of options. I mean, there were a ton of options in this game. Like, you know, they really play on the butterfly effect. And I think that's an important part of queerness, right? Like having choice, having agency, but also like there are so many love interests. Like it doesn't like.
Really? Aren't there just two?
Well, yes, but I don't have limits. I will ship Max and Victoria. This is not, I don't care about what's his face. I don't give a shit.
I like him as Max's friend. I don't think that's a relationship.
But it's not an appealing romance option, right? So like this game is like so fucking gay to me, right? Like there are a ton of women everywhere that I love. Like this is gay. And that feels freeing, but also I think it's interesting to consider that the apocalypse is on a smaller scale. Like can we think about these? If you have more of one, you get less of the other. I'm not sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, I like your point that it is like a choice-based game. It is about like making your own story. I mean, and we can recognize that like part of that's an illusion of choice, which is a lot of what these games have to do. But I agree, it's about how it feels when you're playing it. People often, one of the gripes they'll have with this game or with The Walking Dead, they'll be like, oh, but the ending's always the same no matter what. And I'm like, well, maybe the ending is, but the journey's not. How I'm experiencing and how I'm feeling, how I'm playing this game is unique. Yeah. And that feels great.
And I mean, this one doesn't have the same ending no matter what.
That's true.
This one, you get to choose how it ends.
Have either of you played Life is Strange 2?
Not yet. I've heard it's really good.
Me neither. I've heard good things, but I haven't touched it yet. I played Captain Spirit, which was the little free one.
I have not played that yet.
Part of me is just weary of sequels. I'm just.
I get that, but what I like is that it's not even really a sequel. It's like its own thing. Yeah. It's like not about Max. It's not about Chloe, and I think that's the right move. I think Chloe, like Max's story, had a good ending. I think they had a comic series that I read a little bit of. It was kind of weird.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but I've heard it's weird. I saw like a panel from it, and like Rachel and Max and Chloe, like they're all three in it.
Oh.
There's some weird timeline shit. Yeah. I read like the first couple issues. It wasn't bad. I just think that the story had a very solid ending, and it didn't need more.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is
Speaking of, which ending did you guys choose?
Town.
So the first time I played, I chose Chloe, but from now I choose Town.
It's really tough.
Because I played it like when I was like 15. I was like in love with Chloe.
Yeah.
That was my type back then. Now I'm like, nah, town. But
I mean, I was also like crushing so hard for this radical, awesome girl, but I don't know. I was just in love with Kate and Victoria, man.
See, I didn't really like them that much when I first played.
Yeah.
Now I'm like in love with them too. But yeah, when I first played, it was definitely Chloe. There was no choice.
All right. Do you want to talk about this next one?
Yeah, so the next two games we have up are not, AAA titles. We've got two indie games. They're both free to play. So the first one I want to talk about is Purrfect Apawcalypse. Do you get the pun? Because it's a furry game. Do you get it? So it's a free to play furry game. I say furry because you play as animals. Like, these are animals. There's no human characters, but they talk, they walk on two legs and everything. Yeah. So you play as Olive, and the game is great. It uses gender neutral pronouns, and so you find yourself in a fucking closet, which is a great metaphor, after the apocalypse happened at a day in school. So there's like some serious gore in both of these games. There's just dead bodies, decapitated, stabbed, ripped in half, just everywhere. So you kind of accept your fate. You're like, okay, well, I'm gonna die. And so your goal for the game is to just find someone to be happy with until you die. So it's literally like a romance game, although there's yeah. I mean, so I actually, the first time I played, so there are 3 characters. There's Brownie, a snack-loving corgi, Sparky, a sporty husky, and Patches, a Dalmatian bookworm. So the first one, I met Sparky, and nope, that's the wrong name. I met Brownie, and she wanted to go eat chocolate. These were dogs, and that's lethal. So we didn't, and we just died together eating chocolate, and it was great.
That's a lot. Holy shit. That's like really intense.
Oh my god.
It's a horror game. Like, it may like look cute. You may be playing as a dog, but like there's blood everywhere. You're like, this is bad.
Yikes.
And so there's like a whole overarching plot, right? But like there are some quick endings like that where you can just choose to like get to the fucking point and die with your person. Wow. Patches is not actually a romance option. I don't want to spoil the game really, but that's not someone that you can just like die happy with. So it's really only Brownie or Sparky, and Olive is gender neutral. So I think it's a pretty good like even footing, like, hey, if you're a straight person, come play this game. Hey, if you're a queer person, come play this game. And it's just more about like the feelings, of wanting love and feeling like the world is ending, which I think is a very queer experience, especially when you're in the closet, right? Like you're so scared, and that's how you start the game. You're literally in the closet. So this is important, I think, to me. It's free to play. Go play it on itch.io. What do you guys think?
I think that this is a good example of how a lot of games are just going with making the protagonist gender neutral, which I think is a very smart move. Like, you don't select... Like, I know Cyberpunk 2077 is going to do this. There isn't a gender. You don't pick a gender at the beginning. You just make your character. Yeah. All the options are available. You just do what you want.
I love that.
Which I think is very smart.
Yeah. I think this looks adorable. I really want to play it now.
Adorable?
It's gory. It is, but also
I love horror, and I think that's amazing.
Then this seems up your alley. I don't know if I could take it.
It's short. It's a rough emotional journey.
Okay.
It sounds like it'll be rough, but
and it's free.
Adorable, and I'm excited.
Yeah, it's free.
It's free. Where did you get it?
Itch.io.
Awesome.
If you look it up there, it'll show up. Make sure to spell it with the pun though, because it won't show up normal. Right. That's also a very queer thing to me. You guys,
what?
Puns.
I think that's a stretch. Straight dads love puns.
True.
I'm not saying other people get love puns, but I would stretch.
I'm just saying I'm gonna collect puns.
You can That's yes. You can acquire them. You can rebrand.
We own puns now.
Okay. You heard it here first, guys.
Use puns all the time. You got it.
Before we move on to the next game, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. No one. But this episode is supported by a patron. Matan sucks at Injustice 2. If you would like your name to be read on our podcast, you can support us at patreon.com/rewind_replay, which is linked in the description below. Thank you, Matan sucks at Injustice 2.
Hee.
Okay, on to our final game.
Yeah, so this last one, the first chapter is free, so it's about a 2-hour play. It is still in development. It is on Kickstarter. I think it ends kind of soon. I don't remember the date, so go back that shit. It's really great. It's beautiful. It's called Scarlet Hollow, and it is, I'm also a choice-driven fan. So it's a choice-driven horror visual novel. It's scary. They have some animated cutscenes where like this dude dies and it's graphic and there are creatures because it's like cryptid based. And it's scary.
Is this the one that's like, is it like in the woods and you're like in a cabin or?
Yeah, so you travel to this very dilapidated town because your aunt has just died. So you're staying with your cousin in this like creepy manor that's basically broken down in a death trap. So you go in the first episode, so spoilers, but you go into town and you meet the kind of like opposing main character. I don't know how the game is going to handle romance, but you meet Stella, and I mean, like you fall in love with Stella. And I didn't try like not going to the woods with Stella. I feel like that's not an option because that's the whole point of the game. But so you go into the woods with Stella. Stella's like a YouTuber. She hunts, she, films videos of cryptids and shit in the woods, or she travels and does that. She's like pretty famous, like relatively. And so you're in there and you meet this guy from town who's like trying to hunt like a bear that's been killing his chickens, except it's not a bear and he ends up dying.
Cool.
And it's terrifying. But I put this on this list because I'm really fucking gay for Stella, you guys. Like I don't know how the game is going to handle this, but I don't think there's an alternative. I think it's just you and Stella.
Ooh.
Okay. I'm really into the sound of this game. I think cryptid hunting visual novel sounds very cool.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous. I
mean,
you
sent us the trailer earlier and I watched it and it looked really cool. I really want to play this now.
And this is maybe not apocalyptic. Again, like I couldn't tell you because it's only chapter 1 that's out.
Yeah, we're gonna do it though because apocalypse and gays.
Yeah, gay is amazing. It's definitely horror. I mean, and so there are like these ditchlings are the creatures that like are haunting the town kind of. And they're just bad omens. They're kind of like Josh from Until Dawn.
How do you mean?
They don't so they're not actually violent. They don't attack you. They'll follow you. They'll stare at you with creepy glowing eyes. They'll get close to you and freak you out. But the guy dies because he's trying to shoot it and they get close and it's dark. Like you have a flashlight, he can't see. Stella has a little dog and he runs away. So, and you have a choice actually. And I think either the dog dies or he does. I don't know. I only played it once, but he ends up shooting himself through
yoink.
His head. Yeah. And it's animated too. So
now that's an epic gamer moment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I'm pretty sure there's like a waiter at the diner. I get strong gay vibes from him. So like this is like it is like we were talking about earlier, right? Like in 2014, this is subtly gay, right? It's not explicit, and more so than with Crispin Jenningham. Like this is very subtly, not explicitly, but like very strongly, like this is gay.
Yeah. Interesting choice coming from a indie game.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe this is what we want to talk about next is, like there are a ton of indie games that are gay. Like, indie people have found a great space and a great community in indie games, not so much in AAA games.
Sure.
But I've also played, and I don't know if this is too general, but I've played more horror games that are AAA.
Yeah, I think
than indie horror.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, I've just played more AAA games straight up. Like,
I play a lot of indie games.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I think. Well, I'm not exactly. Yeah. Why do we seem to see a lot of queer characters in these kind of games specifically, like apocalypse, end of the world stuff, or horror stuff in particular? Why do you think they show up there?
I mean, I think one of the main reasons is that when we start to see like end of the world stories, we start to see like people without societal pressures, and that allows us to have these characters that are gay. And like, I don't know why that would be. I don't know. This is kind of contradictory because it's still like society that's creating the characters, but then like we're able to see them in these games. So I don't know exactly why these would. I guess what I'm trying to say is like these would be the type of games to do it in because it's a little more like free for all, like anything can happen. And people always, there's always like the problem of like people think that, oh, you can't have gay characters in like children's stuff because like being gay is somehow like more sexual than straight. So then when you have like end of the world stories, like zombie stories, those tend to not be children's stories.
You face less pushback. Interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it, like in terms of genre, right? Like this is clearly rated M or higher.
Yeah, so that's a good point. It seems like, I mean, I know there was an issue with YouTube flagging queer content creators for their content being sexual, when in fact they were just talking about, their sexual identity, not the sexual aspect of that. So yeah, that is a common held belief that somehow like, again, like straight is normal and queer is deviant and it is about sex, which it is not.
Yeah. I mean, what I think is interesting is that, so in some ways, right, like these horror games, apocalypse games, give people the freedom to just be gay. Like society is broken down, it doesn't fucking matter.
Right.
And yet it's still an important like identity, like, oh, you're gay, like it's still different. Like we see this, I think like the first example I can think of is actually for The Last of Us Part 2, where like old white men like still exist, like they still don't approve, like really, dude, like you could get eaten by a zombie and you give a shit about what this 18-year-old girl is doing in her bed.
But is it a gay zombie?
Yeah.
I'll get infected with the cordyceps. I will not get infected with the gay.
The gay cordyceps.
Like,
yeah,
it just,
I mean, that's,
it makes no sense. But it does. It's terrifying.
Right. I liked, Caitlin, your point about how the end of the world sort of, not that everybody is ever free entirely from societal pressures, but like end of the world stories do allow us to kind of be without a lot of rules. But also, I agree with that, but also in some situations, like with the Seraphites for Lev, we also get to see communities that are like radicalized. They have sort of these elevated social restrictions, which like mirror our society, but intensified to sort of raise the stakes. They give us a way to look at these situations, like a lot of extraordinary fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, or whatever. They take real life issues and then raise the stakes dramatically such that we can look at them in a different light. Which I think is useful. I mean, again, like, our society still doesn't like trans people, but like in the Seraphites group, they wanted to kill Lev because he cut his hair. Like the stakes being intense, it is, I'm sorry, I forget where I was going with that.
I mean, the thing is, like, I don't actually think it's different.
I don't.
I think we're just not, like, we personally don't live in a Seraphite-esque town where a trans person is gonna get collectively stoned to death.
You're right.
But like, it happens.
Yeah.
The average life. Sorry, Caitlin, go ahead.
Oh, I was just agreeing that it still happens.
You're right. The average lifespan for trans people is dramatically low. I think it's in the 30s or something. It's very low because of homicide. It is a terrible and widespread issue. What I'm trying to get at is just like, when, you know, even if it's through this fiction, like those are not communities, those are not worlds in which that I am familiar with. I live in Berkeley. Like, this is one of the most liberal, it has its own problems, of course, but it's one of the most liberal areas in the country. And I've lived in, you know, Seattle and LA, which are also extraordinarily liberal. So I do not get a look into these worlds. And that is ideally what games do, is they let you see how other people live. They let you walk in other people's shoes. And I think that games like this with life or death stakes can do that well.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I do kind of want to talk about is the idea that you put it very well, Matan, that games let you, you know, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, which I think contrasted with the idea that the default in gaming, right, is a white straight man, much like Joel.
Right.
I love him. I love him.
Of course.
But,
of course.
you know, not to shit talk Joel, that's not what I mean. But those two things actually feel quite contradictory, right? Like, if the purpose of a game is to let you walk a mile in someone's shoes, why am I playing as a straight white man who's the societal default, right? Like, we all live in a patriarchy, so we know that perspective pretty well already.
It's true.
And so I actually think, you know, in some ways, we're seeing a lot of regression.
Like in
and also
ways?
Advancement, right? So like the main protagonists are still not, you know, diverse people. But at the same time, we get really explicit queer narratives. But also, you know, if you take older games and like you decide, right, like if I was living in the 80s, I probably would not have had this experience. Mayhaps, I don't know, I wasn't alive then. But like, if I now played a game from way back when, a lot of them were surprisingly queer. And so like that kind of like,
how do you mean?
Falls into a very murky argument. So there are some articles and books on this.
Oh, I was just gonna say, can you explain it?
Caitlin?
Yeah.
I think I'm lagging. What is happening?
Yeah.
What?
It's okay. I might be.
I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, so.
Go ahead, Adriana.
Yeah, so I'm specifically referencing a book called Video Games Have Always Been Queer by Bo Rudberg, amazing person. And so the whole book kind of goes through and details, it pushes against the idea that narrative games now are becoming more diverse. And kind of arguing that games, even at its inception, were intended for minority people to, you know, or for majority people, and to get at that walking a mile in someone else's shoe. That has always been the intent of games. So they've always been, you know, intended to be read queerly, which again, intention is very different from like what actually happens, which is why we have games with main characters who are white people. And, you know, we see this a lot in like Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, this was a game for people who got bullied constantly and were associated with being gay because they were nerdy. And And that same community, you know, in its early history, despite the reason like this is going to be a safe space for people who are bullied, when bullied other people like women and queer people, right? So we get a lot of, you know, self-hate and infighting, but the purpose, like you said, is to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And I think we're just so entrenched in like minutia and identity politics that, you know, it's really easy to get caught up in the ways we are fucking up and succeeding now.
I think you made some good points. I actually have not read Bo Rupert's book, and that could be really interesting, actually. It sounds like something that would be a good read. But I would push back, at least based on what I know right now, on the idea, like, past games may be queerer than we think, but queer narratives, there are more queer narratives today, and more, you know, what is it? Like narratives about people of color nowadays than there were then. Games might have been played more queerly. Games might have been, you know, some of the bigger games might have been more. But I think we're hitting on more narratives. That's the exact point. Now.
Yeah, that's the exact point of the book, right? So it is more explicitly queer now. Like absolutely 100%. It is more diverse now. We have stories about Black people. We have stories about trans people. But we also shouldn't ignore and devalue if you are a queer person playing a game in 1980 something, you play it queerly because you are.
Gotcha. That sounds like a very interesting book.
Yeah.
You hit it, man.
Well, I think
just all games are queer, you guys, not just horror. Let's go.
That would be a much longer podcast. But for now, we're gonna end it there. Thank you everybody very much for listening and watching. We put out new episodes of our podcast every Friday, wherever you get podcasts or on YouTube with a video element. We've been doing some new content on our YouTube channel. We've got some tabletop games coming, and we have a couple out. We're doing some podficking. We've got some other forms of shorter content coming down the pipeline as well. We've all started streaming on Twitch. Those are linked in the description below, as well as our socials. The links to a couple of the articles we talked about today and our Patreon. Do you guys have anything else you want to mention before we go?
Tell us what your favorite horror games are, you guys.
Yeah, and your favorite queer games are.
Yes.
Are they the same?
We will absolutely check them out. If you post these in the comments, we will absolutely check them out.
Yeah, we will. Even if you don't, we'll read your mind.
Yes, and my parting thought is I wanted to say, like, our perspectives on trans issues are limited, being cis people. Like, my perspectives on women issues is limited, not being a woman. Like, all of us are really just trying to understand and do our best here. So if one of us, particularly myself, being the one I think is the most limited on some of these issues, like, says something that you may deem offensive or uneducated, I really do not mean to cause offense. Like, just let me know and try to help me understand these issues better. I am not trying to take up your space. I'm trying to educate myself. I'm trying to do the best job of discussing these things as possible.
Yeah, I mean, so and kind of part of this was most of the games and characters we're talking about as either bisexual, pansexual, lesbian, and not including trans people in our discussion felt inappropriate to do. So it's a hard line, you know, should I talk about something I'm not familiar with, but I don't want to exclude something just because I'm not familiar with it and take it away out of the narrative.
For sure. It's a tough,
so let us know.
It's a tough line to walk. It's a good point.
Let us know. Educate us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And with that, we will catch you all next time.
Bye.